Orion Caldwell cursed under his breath as he rattled the locked door handle of his vacation home. The sleek, modern estate perched on the cliffs overlooking the ocean was supposed to be his sanctuary. Instead, it had become his latest frustration. His security system had malfunctioned, his phone was locked inside, and his weekend escape was off to a terrible start. He ran a hand through his dark hair, sighing. He had two choices: call a locksmith and wait hours, or swallow his pride and ask for help. His gaze drifted to the neighboring house, a charming, ivy-covered cottage with a wraparound porch. He had never met the owner. In the years he had owned the estate, he had never needed to, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Shoving his hands into his pockets, Orion made his way up the stone path to the front door and knocked. The door swung open almost immediately. A woman stood before him, barefoot, wearing denim shorts and a loose, paint-streaked t-shirt. Her chestnut hair was tied up in a messy bun, and her green eyes flashed with curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice light but guarded. Orion cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how ridiculous he must look, an irritated CEO in an expensive suit, standing at her doorstep like a lost boy. "I locked myself out of my house," he admitted. "And I was hoping you might have a phone I could use." She studied him for a second before stepping aside. "Come in." The inside of her home was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the minimalist luxury of his own. It smelled like fresh coffee and something sweet. Canvases leaned against the walls, half-finished paintings scattered across the space. "I'm Emilia Parker," she said, handing him her phone. "You live next door, right?" "Yes, Orion Caldwell." He dialed the locksmith and arranged for them to come as soon as possible. Ending the call, he handed the phone back. "Thank you." Emilia crossed her arms and leaned against the kitchen counter. "You don't seem like the type to ask for help." Orion arched an eyebrow. "What type do I seem like?" she shrugged. "The kind of guy who probably has a private jet, a dozen assistants, and a calendar booked out for the next 5 years. He let out a low chuckle. "Not far off," she grinned. "Figures." Before he could respond, a loud crash of thunder rumbled outside. Within seconds, rain poured down in heavy sheets. Emilia glanced toward the window. "Well, looks like you're stuck here until the storm passes." Orion sighed, loosening his tie. "Great." Emilia grabbed a mug and filled it with coffee, then set it in front of him. "Might as well make yourself comfortable." As the storm raged outside, Orion found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He sat back, sipped coffee, and talked. To his surprise, Emilia didn't treat him like every other person in his life. She wasn't impressed by his wealth, nor intimidated by his name. She teased him, challenged him, and, for the first time in a long time, he felt something unexpected, intrigued. When the locksmith finally arrived hours later, Orion almost didn't want to leave. As he stepped back into the rain, he turned toward Emilia. "Thank you for the coffee and the company," she smiled. "Anytime, neighbor." As Orion walked back to his estate, he realized something strange. He had spent years in that house, but it had never once felt as warm as Emilia's home had in a single evening. And for the first time, he wondered why. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind the scent of rain and the rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs. Orion stood on the balcony of his estate, coffee in hand, gazing toward the neighboring cottage. He had spent years retreating to this house for solitude, for a break from boardrooms and negotiations. Yet, in a single evening, Emilia Parker had unsettled something in him. She was unlike anyone in his world, unconcerned with status, completely at ease in her space, and entirely uninterested in impressing him. And he found himself thinking about her more than he cared to admit. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, he was surprised to find Emilia standing there, holding a small plate covered with foil. "I figured you didn't have anything in your kitchen but bottled water and overpriced coffee beans," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "So I made muffins." Orion arched a brow. "You think I can't cook?" She gave him a pointed look. "Can you?" He hesitated, then exhaled a quiet laugh. "No, exactly." She set the plate on the marble countertop. You seem like the kind of guy who orders steak at every meal and calls it a day. You're not far off, he admitted, peeling back the foil. The scent of cinnamon and something sweet drifted up. He picked up a muffin and took a bite. It was warm, soft, and entirely too good. She watched him expectantly. So, he nodded. Not terrible, she scoffed. Not terrible, that's all I get. He took another bite, chewing slowly. Fine, they're good. She rolled her eyes but grinned. You're impossible. Orion leaned against the counter, studying her. You do this often, she tilted her head. Bake or barge into my neighbor's house uninvited. Both, Emilia shrugged. I like making things. Painting, baking, fixing up old furniture keeps my hands busy. He gestured toward the plate. And do you always bring food to strangers? She met his gaze. You're not a stranger anymore, are you? Something in the air shifted. It was subtle but undeniable. Orion wasn't a man who let people in easily. He had spent years building walls, keeping his life neatly arranged and his emotions locked away. But Emilia Parker had wandered right past his barriers as if they didn't exist, and he wasn't sure he minded. She glanced around his kitchen. This place is too perfect. Do you even use it? I have people who handle that, she shook her head. Of course you do, he smirked. Something wrong with efficiency? There's a difference between efficiency and never actually living in your own home. She walked toward the window, looking out at the ocean. You have this incredible view, but do you ever sit here and just enjoy it? Orion hesitated. He had bought this house because it was beautiful, because it was private, because it was everything a man of his status was supposed to own, but had he ever truly enjoyed it? Before he could answer, Emilia turned back to him. Come over for dinner tonight, he blinked. Excuse me? You heard me. She leaned against the counter. I cook, you eat, basic human interaction. Orion had a dozen reasons to say no. He had meetings to review, calls to return, an entire empire that demanded his attention. And yet, for some inexplicable reason, he found himself saying, What time? Emilia grinned. 7. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out, leaving behind the scent of cinnamon and the unsettling realization that, for the first time in a long time, Orion Caldwell was looking forward to something that had nothing to do with his business. Orion arrived at Emilia's cottage just as the sky deepened into shades of indigo. The porch light cast a golden glow over the front steps, and the scent of something rich and savory drifted through the open windows. He had spent the afternoon convincing himself that this dinner was nothing more than a neighborly courtesy. Yet, as he knocked on the door, an unfamiliar flicker of anticipation settled in his chest. Emilia pulled the door open, a wooden spoon in hand, her hair loosely gathered at her nape. Soft jazz played in the background, mingling with the aroma of rosemary and garlic. Perfect timing, she said, stepping aside. I was about to start without you. Orion scanned the warm interior, the soft glow of pendant lights making the space feel even more inviting than he remembered. Wouldn't want to miss out. She gestured toward the table, already set with mismatched plates and a bottle of wine breathing in the center. I hope you like pasta. If not, well, tough luck. He pulled out a chair, watching as she moved around the kitchen with effortless ease. You always cook for guests, or am I special? She gave him a look. You think I make homemade pasta for just anyone. Should I be flattered? Probably. She slid a steaming bowl in front of him before settling across the table. I don't let just anyone into my kitchen. Orion twirled a forkful of pasta, the taste bursting with fresh herbs and something he couldn't quite place. This is better than any 5-star restaurant I've been to. She leaned back, studying him. Do you always compare things to luxury? He considered that. It's the world I live in. Maybe you should try stepping outside of it once in a while. A low chuckle escaped him. And do what instead? Something real, something that doesn't come with a price tag. Orion met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. And what do you consider real? She rested her chin on her hand. Sunsets that make you stop in your tracks, music that makes you feel something, laughing so hard you forget why you were upset in the first place. He took a sip of wine, the weight of her words settling in his mind. That sounds peaceful. You say that like it's something you've never had. His jaw tightened slightly. Maybe I haven't. Emilia didn't pry, didn't press for answers he wasn't ready to give. Instead, she poured more wine and shifted the conversation to lighter topics: travel, childhood memories, the most ridiculous situations they had ever found themselves in. For the first time in years, Orion found himself unwinding without effort. No pretense, no calculated remarks, just the simple act of being. As the evening stretched on, Emilia stood and disappeared into the kitchen before returning with a plate of something dusted with powdered sugar. "You made dessert too?" Orion asked, raising an eyebrow. "Of course." "I'm not a monster." He took a bite, the crisp shell giving way to a soft, sweet filling. "You run some kind of underground bakery I should know about," she laughed. "Just a hobby, something I do when I need to clear my head." He set his fork down, watching her. "And what is it you need to clear your head from?" For the first time that night, she hesitated. "Life, expectations, the occasional existential crisis. So you're human, after all." She rolled her eyes but smiled. "Shocking, I know." The quiet between them was comfortable, the kind that didn't demand to be filled. Orion leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I can't remember the last time I had a night like this." Emilia tilted her head. "Like what?" "One that wasn't scheduled or planned down to the minute." She studied him for a moment before setting her napkin aside. "So what now, Mr. CEO? Are you going to return to your perfectly structured life and forget all about this little detour?" The question was meant to be teasing, but something about it settled deep in his chest. "I don't think I could forget this if I tried," he admitted. Something flickered in her expression: surprise, maybe, or something else he couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, Orion Caldwell wasn't thinking about his company, his wealth, or his responsibilities. He was thinking about a woman who had no interest in any of those things. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if that terrified him or thrilled him. Orion stood at the threshold of Emilia's door, the warmth of the evening still lingering around them. The meal was finished, the wine bottle nearly empty, but neither of them made a move to end the night. Something unspoken stretched between them, weighted and undeniable. "You're thinking too hard," Emilia said, her voice soft but teasing. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't usually do things without thinking." She leaned against the doorframe, studying him in the golden light. "Maybe that's the problem." Orion shook his head, a quiet chuckle escaping him. "You have an answer for everything, don't you?" She tilted her head. "Only when I'm right." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was charged. Orion had spent years mastering control, calculating every move before making it. But with Emilia, there was no strategy, no agenda, just a pull so strong he couldn't ignore it. "You're dangerous," he murmured. She raised an eyebrow. "How do you figure?" He took a step closer, his voice lower now. "You make me forget everything else." For a moment, she didn't reply. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his palm. Maybe forgetting isn't such a bad thing. He hadn't planned to kiss her. He hadn't planned any of this. But standing there, with the scent of her still lingering in the air, with the night pressing in around them, Orion closed the small space between them and captured her lips with his. It wasn't tentative or unsure, it was absolute. Emilia's fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer as his hands found her waist. The world outside the small cottage, the expectations, the responsibilities, all of it faded into nothing. There was only her. When they finally parted, her breath was unsteady and so was his. She looked up at him, something unreadable in her expression. "That was unexpected," she murmured. Orion's lips curved slightly. "Was it?" She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "Okay, maybe not entirely." His fingers traced along her wrist, memorizing the feel of her skin. "I should probably go before you completely undo me," she smiled, but there was something softer behind it now. "Too late." He pressed one final kiss to her forehead before stepping back. "Good night, Emilia." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer. "Good night, Orion." He walked back to his estate, the ocean air cool against his skin, but the warmth of her still lingering in his chest. The next morning, Orion found himself restless, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted. He had spent years controlling every aspect of his life, ensuring nothing and no one could disrupt the balance he had created. And yet, Emilia had done it without even trying. By midday, he was standing at her front door again, this time with 2 coffees in hand. She opened the door, blinking in surprise. "Back already?" He held out one of the cups. "I figured it was only fair. You made dinner, I bring coffee." She accepted it with a curious smile. "And here I thought you had people to do that for you." He leaned against the door frame, mirroring the way she had the night before. "I'm trying something different." Emilia stepped aside, gesturing him in. "Careful, Caldwell. You might start enjoying it." As he entered, something settled in him, a realization, maybe. Orion Caldwell had spent his life building an empire, constructing walls so high no one could get through. And yet, here he was, standing in the middle of a small cottage that smelled like coffee and paint, realizing that for the first time in years he didn't want to be anywhere else. Orion hadn't intended to stay long, but time had a way of slipping away in Emilia's presence. What was supposed to be a quick coffee drop-off turned into an hour, then 2. Their conversation moved in unexpected directions: books they had read, places they wanted to visit, childhood memories they hadn't thought about in years. At some point, she pulled him outside to the back porch, where the view of the ocean stretched endlessly before them. A soft breeze carried the scent of salt and wildflowers, and the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs filled the quiet between them. "You never told me why you bought that house," she said, turning to look at him. Orion followed her gaze to his estate, a striking contrast to the warmth of Emilia's cottage. "I needed an escape." "From what?" He exhaled slowly. "Everything." She didn't press, just waited, giving him space to find the words. "For years, my life has been about control, every decision, every move calculated. The company, the people who depend on me, I can't afford to make mistakes." He ran a hand along the railing, watching the tide pull in. "I thought if I had a place to disappear, even for a little while, maybe I could breathe." Emilia studied him, her expression unreadable. "And does it work?" Orion hesitated. "Until recently, I thought it did." Something flickered in her eyes, but she didn't say anything right away. Instead, she leaned against the railing, thoughtful. "You know, I used to think running away was the answer too," she admitted. He turned to her, surprised. "You ran from something." She let out a quiet laugh, not in the dramatic sense, but yeah, "I left behind a life that wasn't mine, expectations I didn't want to meet. I thought if I started over somewhere quiet, somewhere far from all of it, I'd finally be free." He watched her carefully. "And are you?" She smiled, but there was something wistful about it. "Most days." Orion wasn't sure what it was, maybe the way the light hit her face, or the honesty in her voice, but something inside him shifted. Emilia wasn't just a distraction, wasn't just another fleeting moment in a life filled with obligations. She was something more. Before he could say anything, Emilia straightened. "Come with me." He raised an eyebrow. "Where?" She didn't answer, just grabbed his hand and pulled him down the steps toward the narrow path that led to the cliffs. He followed without question, the warmth of her fingers against his sending a strange, unfamiliar energy through him. They walked in silence, the sound of the ocean growing louder as they neared the edge. Emilia stopped at a spot where a small, makeshift wooden bench overlooked the water. She sat, patting the space beside her. Orion lowered himself onto the bench, glancing at her in curiosity. "This is where I come when I need to remind myself why I chose this life," she said, gazing out at the horizon. "Whenever I start to doubt if I made the right decision, I sit here and watch the water. It always reminds me that the world is bigger than whatever's weighing me down." Orion followed her gaze, watching the endless stretch of blue. He had seen the ocean 1,000 times from private yachts, from the windows of his estate, from luxury resorts. But sitting here beside her, it felt different. "Do you regret it?" he asked after a while. She didn't answer immediately. "No. But sometimes I wonder if I was supposed to find something more." Orion shifted, his fingers brushing against hers where they rested on the bench. "Maybe you already have." She turned to him, her green eyes searching his. Something passed between them, then silent, certain, inevitable. Orion had spent his entire life chasing success, proving himself, making sure every move was the right one. But sitting here under the vast sky with Emilia beside him, he realized something startling. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the next step. He was just here. And for once, that was enough. Orion had never considered himself the kind of man to let his guard down so easily, but sitting beside Emilia, watching the waves move in endless, hypnotic patterns, he realized that his carefully structured world was unraveling in ways he couldn't control. And he didn't want to stop it. She glanced at him, her fingers absently tracing the grain of the wooden bench. "You're quiet," he let out a slow breath. "I don't think I've ever just sat like this before, no agenda, no distractions. Just being." A soft breeze lifted strands of her hair and she tucked them behind her ear, smiling to herself. "It's nice, isn't it?" He turned toward her, his gaze steady. "You make it nice." She looked at him then, and he saw something flicker in her expression, something hesitant, as if she wasn't sure what to do with the weight of his words. "You're used to people wanting something from you, aren't you?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. There was no point in pretending otherwise. Always. She nodded, as if she had already known. But not here. The certainty in her tone settled something inside him. Emilia had never asked for anything. She had never treated him as anything more than a man, not a CEO, not a billionaire. Just Orion, and that meant more than he could put into words. She stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. "Come on," he raised an eyebrow. "Where are we going now?" She tilted her head toward the path, back to the house. "You're learning how to make something with your own hands." A rare laugh escaped him. "I highly doubt that," she grinned. "You'd be surprised." Back at the cottage, she pulled out ingredients with practiced ease, moving around the kitchen like it was an extension of herself. Orion rolled up the sleeves of his shirt, watching her with amusement. "Don't just stand there looking important," she teased. "You're helping." He picked up a wooden spoon, holding it as if it might bite him. "You're sure about this?" She placed a bowl in front of him. "Start mixing." He followed her instructions somewhat awkwardly at first, but with growing confidence. She guided him through each step, her hands occasionally brushing against his as she corrected his technique. "You're not terrible at this," she admitted after a while. He looked at the mess he had made on the counter. "That's generous," she laughed, shaking her head. "It's not about perfection, it's about doing something because you enjoy it." Orion considered that as he continued working. He had spent his life chasing success, striving for excellence in everything. But standing here, covered in flour, making something that didn't need to be perfect, there was a strange sort of peace in it. As they waited for the oven timer to chime, Emilia leaned against the counter, watching him with something unreadable in her expression. "You're different than I expected," she said. He glanced at her. "And what did you expect?" She shrugged. "Someone colder, untouchable. The kind of man who doesn't let anyone in." A pause stretched between them before he spoke again. "I was." Her breath hitched slightly, as if she hadn't been prepared for the honesty in his voice. She didn't look away. "What changed?" He reached for her hand, his fingers sliding against hers with deliberate slowness. "You," she exhaled softly, her grip tightening around his. The moment was interrupted by the oven's chime. Emilia blinked, then let out a breathless laugh. "Well, that was dramatic timing." Orion smiled, but he didn't let go of her hand. Later, as they sat on the porch, sharing the imperfect but surprisingly good results of their efforts, there was an ease between them that hadn't been there before, and Orion knew this wasn't temporary. He wasn't going back to the way things were before. He wasn't sure he even could. Days passed, then weeks, and Orion found himself spending more time at the cottage than at his own estate. Mornings were filled with coffee and quiet conversations, evenings with home-cooked meals and laughter. It was unlike anything he had ever known, simple, real, unguarded. One evening, as they walked along the cliffs, Orion stopped abruptly. Emilia turned, puzzled. "What is it?" He reached into his pocket, his heart pounding in a way it never had, not in boardrooms, not in high-stakes deals, not even in moments of triumph. Taking a steady breath, he dropped to one knee. Emilia's eyes widened, her hands flying to her mouth. "I used to think I had everything," he said, "but I didn't, not until you." He took her hand, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. I don't want to spend another day without you, Emilia. Marry me." Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment she didn't speak. Then, with a choked laugh, she nodded. Yes. Relief flooded him as he slid the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he could. He had built an empire, he had conquered the world, but this was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Their wedding was small, intimate. A ceremony overlooking the ocean, with the waves as their witness and the sun dipping low in the sky. Emilia wore a simple dress, her hair loose and free, and Orion had never seen anything more beautiful in his life. As they exchanged vows, there was no hesitation, no doubts. This was real, this was forever. And as Orion took Emilia into his arms, pressing his lips to hers, he knew he had finally found the one thing he never knew he was missing. Love, and he would never let it go.